You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. Here's a question for you, deer hunters. Why are the deer bigger historically in the Delta than, say, in the Pine Belt? Well, studies have been done by people like the man who's on our show today, Steve Demarais from the MSU Deer Lab on the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast.
This episode of the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast is brought to you by the Foundation for Mississippi Wildlife, Fisheries, Parks, and Marine.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. Today, our guest, someone who's been involved in the study of deer ecology and deer management for over 40 years, which is a really short period of time in the grand scheme of things, but a lot of experience. Mr. Steve Demarais from the MSU Deer Lab at Mississippi State. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to be here.
So 42 years in deer management and ecology. When you look back at that, and I know that a lot of times we tell a story, we start at the beginning and work our way to the end. I'm kind of looking back at it with you now, but in that 42 years, how do you summarize kind of what that career was like and what it has meant to you looking back at those 4 decades?
Great question. It's summarized in passion, joy, and a feeling of achievement. Because I got into the field of wildlife management because I was a passionate hunter and angler. And I remember when I was in high school, my parents said, "You're going to college. We don't care what you study." They both left school in the 8th grade to start working in factories. I'm from Massachusetts, by the way.
Okay.
So up there, you worked in factories. And so I figured, well, I've got to go to the guidance department, the guidance counselor, and see what kind of jobs there are, what I could major on. Flipping through a book, and I saw this page that said Wildlife Biologist, and it talked about what they do and the courses they take, and I loved biology. I loved hunting and fishing. I thought, wow, I'm going to be a wildlife biologist. So junior year of my high school, I decided I was going to be a wildlife biologist, and I haven't looked back, and it's been such a blessing in my life to be able to do things that are of interest to people like you and myself that are hunters and fishermen and natural resource people, and to be able to talk to biologists and landowners and hunters about what we do as researchers and have them pay attention and you see them nodding their head. Man, Matt, that is so much juice.
Yeah,
it really is. It's just been a blessing.
And 4 decades of that kind of experience for you too.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So growing up in Massachusetts, what kind of hunting and fishing were you introduced to as a kid there?
Well, hunting, I did rabbit hunting and deer hunting.
Okay.
And I literally, people think of Massachusetts as this big metropolitan area.
Right.
I lived about 40 miles south of Boston in a little town called Attleboro. And it was a factory town, but I could walk 2 blocks. When I'd get out of the factory at lunchtime on Saturday, I'd eat lunch and then take my shotgun and I'd walk 2 blocks down and go into the woods and I'd walk and shoot anything that was legal when they flew or ran away. And it wasn't like I was hunting anything in particular. I was just enjoying the outdoors.
Yeah, that's really neat. I've been to Massachusetts one time, and it was for a Mississippi State football game against UMass.
Yep.
A few years ago, actually, and they played in Foxborough where the Patriots play. Mm-hmm. So, and I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to see what this looks like. And we fly into Boston and then hop on a bus, and they're taking us up to where we're going to stay outside of Foxborough. And I was a little bit struck by it's forest and it's woodlands between Boston. I mean, it's like being out in the country in this part of the country. I didn't really expect that because you're right. The stereotype I have of Massachusetts is big buildings and concrete streets.
Yeah. Nobody goes out and films the regular habitat. But not when I left there to come to Mississippi State for graduate school in 1977, it was 95% forested. I don't know what it is now, but very similar to Mississippi's composition in terms of forest lands.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so you said 1977 you left to come to Mississippi State. How did you go from I want to be a wildlife biologist as a junior in high school to Mississippi State? How did you discover State? How did they discover you?
Well, I wanted to work in the wildlife biology, and I'm a planner and a thinker, and so I thought, well, I need to pick an area of specialty so I could be more competitive for grad school. So I looked at wildlife diseases, and I wrote to different wildlife disease specialists around the country, and I heard about Dr. Harry Jacobson, who was here, and that he had a project on wildlife disease, deer diseases. Wrote to him, and he offered me a position, and I came down and haven't looked back since.
That's really incredible. So you, from Massachusetts to Mississippi State as a student.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I stayed here 5 years, got my master's and PhD, and then I went to Texas for 15 years where I was a professor at Texas A&M Kingsville, and then most of the time at the Red Raiders, Texas Tech.
Yeah.
And then when Harry retired, I came here to replace him.
Okay. Really a cool story to kind of see how, well, I guess overall, if we back up, the sport of deer hunting, I mean, really how the sport of deer hunting connects people. You're an example of how it's connected parts of the country, Massachusetts, Mississippi.
Absolutely.
And here you are. And that's really, when we talk about deer management, I mean, that's really what it's about, is deer hunting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I was passionate back then. Me and my cousins, we'd go up to Vermont and hunt for a weekend, opening weekend, gun season. We'd have 2 days in the woods. We rarely saw a deer, but there were deer out there. We see the tracks, and I wasn't a very good hunter, but never killed a deer. Finally came down here, and it was like, wow, there's deer everywhere.
Yeah. So how is deer hunting in Massachusetts, Vermont different?
Oh, it's hugely different
from here.
In that we used to just go down the road, park, and go out into the woods and hunt. We had no idea whose land we were hunting on.
Okay.
And it was just an open access generally. Now, that was 45, 50 years ago. I don't know what it's like now. I'm sure it's more restricted. But back then, literally you just go in the woods.
Yeah. How about
and
that?
You drag out what you shoot.
27 years for you at Mississippi State and in the Deer Lab, and just retired this past June. Like, you're a few months into, I guess, official retirement.
Yep.
What's that been like for you?
Well, yeah, it's been an experience, Matt. It's kind of like when you opening day of deer season. There's frustrations with the opening day of deer season when the alarm goes off. I don't really feel like getting up, and I wasn't just greatly happy to be retiring. I loved my job. I loved the people I worked with, but it was time. And so I'm out on the deer stand opening day, and the sun's starting to come up, and I don't know what that's going to look like exactly. I don't know if I'm going to see deer. I don't know if I'm going to harvest a deer, but I know it feels right. And it feels good, and I'm happy about it, and that's how I am right now. I don't know what my retirement is going to consist of exactly, but I'm loving the feeling. I'm in the woods, and it's a great place to be.
Yeah, that's a heck of an analogy. Makes a lot of sense too. Sort of I guess a lot of us, when we glance ahead at possible retirement, we don't think about the waking up each day and the anticipation of what life can hold. But that sounds like the anticipation of being in a deer stand on opening day. That's a neat analogy. I never actually heard it described that way. I guess it would make sense too that for you it might be a deer hunting analogy, huh?
Works for me.
That's great. As far as your work at the Deer Lab, and in that amount of time, all those years, almost 3 decades there. What work? Is there a project? Is there an initiative or something that sort of stands out to you that you were a part of in that time?
Well, the main motivation for me professionally to come back was to be able to work with the agency. And I told them, right from the get-go, I'm coming back to work with the green shirts. And back then, everybody wore just green shirts. But I loved being part of the research arm of the agency, because that guaranteed that whatever I was doing were things that mattered to the agency, and what mattered to the agency were management-oriented things and things that mattered to landowners and hunters. And I've always loved doing what matters to people that do other things too.
Sure.
I wouldn't want to be a theoretical ecologist and write models and write about, well, this could happen or this might happen. I want to do things that if you do this, this will happen. And it matters to our wildlife populations.
So I had been given a list of things that are the types of questions that cover subjects that you guys at the Deer Lab are experts in.
Yeah.
One of those is in regards to breeding. What bucks are doing the breeding? Oh, yeah. We talked with Bronson a little bit about how does a doe choose, or does she choose based on antler size?
Yeah.
But as far as individual bucks, like which bucks are doing the breeding, if someone asks you that question, they walk up to you and say, "Hey, I know you're with the Deer Lab."
Yep.
How do you address that in a conversation?
Well, it was really cutting edge work at the time. We used genetic studies to document in our research pens. We'd have a set of does and 3 different bucks in each of our pens, and we'd monitor them, watching their behavior. But behavior, you see the dominance interaction between the bucks. You think, oh, the dominant buck's going to do all the breeding. Well, absolutely not. We've showed that in the pens, the dominant bucks did not control the breeding. They might have first dibs, but there were second dibs and third dibs, and we had yearling bucks breeding within pens with 3 and 4 year old bucks. So we learned that within the pens, and then we looked at populations, 3 different populations in the wild: Noxubee National Wildlife Refuge, the King Ranch in South Texas, and then a moderately managed, well managed, but maybe a quality deer management approach. Okay. King Ranch was trophy management. The Oklahoma property was managing for 3 year old bucks, kind of like QDM now. Mm-hmm. And then Noxubee Refuge at the time was, if it's legal, shoot it.
Yeah.
And so in all 3 of those properties, even though they had greatly different sex ratios, trophy management, you have a lot more bucks in the population. QDM, you have a moderate number of bucks. Noxubee Refuge, you don't have many bucks once the hunters start shooting them all.
Right.
In all those cases, there were a large number of bucks breeding, irregardless of age. Now, in a trophy situation where there's a lot of older age class bucks, they generally do control the breeding. But we had maybe 20 to 30% of breeding in a trophy management scheme being done by 1 and 2 year old bucks.
Really? Up to 30%?
Yes.
Wow. See, and I think most of us wouldn't just think that. Yeah. Just trying to roll over what we think we know in our head. We wouldn't guess that.
Yep. It has to be just the dominant buck.
It has to be, yeah.
What we showed for people was if you protect this big antlered buck with the intent that he's going to be your brood sire out there because he's the big antlered, that's not the case.
That's not the
Absolutely
case.
Not the case. And even antler size wasn't a considerable factor in determining who was going to be breeding. It really had to do with attitude.
Okay.
Attitude. And we did a more intensive study in our pens where we have to cut the antlers off. And we looked at the age of the deer, assuming that the older bucks would be more dominant, and they generally were within the buck hierarchy. But the age of the buck only explained less than 50% of who was doing the breeding. Body mass also, which was kind of tied to age. The larger bodied bucks tended to do the majority of the breeding, but the rest of the breeding consideration wasn't those 2 main factors, and I like to call it attitude. If a buck is, has
confidence.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the urge to be persistent. Mm-hmm. He's going to do a lot of breeding. And also we studied the first people in the world to document multiple paternity in white-tailed deer. We actually found about 20 to 25% of populations of deer in our pens and also in the wild. Of the twins, 20 to roughly a quarter of the twins are sired by different bucks.
Really?
Yeah. So that blew our mind and a lot of people's minds.
Wow.
There are just so many bucks, a large number of the bucks in a population are breeding. So the idea you're selecting and protecting this brood buck because he's going to do he isn't.
Right.
And it's biologically impossible because of the type of breeding system that whitetails have. Okay. They're not a herding animal where like elk are.
Yeah.
The dominant bull is going to control the access to all of the hinds or cows in his group. Whitetails are spread all around the world.
So how common is it for a deer to have twins?
1 out of 4 sets of how many? The average doe is going to have twins.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So it happens a lot.
Yes.
And you found that, what was the percentage again that were
25% of the twins are sired by different bucks.
Different bucks. Goodness. So you don't have the herd aspect that you do you compared it to say elk, more spread out.
Yeah, individual does spread across the landscape. And so if there is a dominant buck and he might be able to control access to a doe, but quarter mile away, there's another doe in estrus, and he's not breeding her. And I'm doing spotlight counts and population estimates at night with spotlights and trucks. And, I've seen a couple of different cases where there was, a buck and 50 yards down the road is another buck. And you just see, start seeing all these bucks, and then you see a doe and a buck standing right next to her. And it was like, that doe is in estrus and that buck is tending her, but there's all these satellite bucks. I've seen as many as 8 bucks around an individual doe that was obviously in estrus. I've seen that 2 or 3 times in my career.
Wow.
And so when that dominant buck breeds her, he's got to, if you use the analogy, go and have a cigarette or go raid the refrigerator after that. And that's when the satellite bucks come in and have their opportunities. So.
And then you have an example where you'd have twins and sired by 2 different. That's really fascinating. And as you were talking, I was also thinking about what Bronson told us when he was here a good bit about that study of the antler size.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Does the antler size of the buck have an effect on his attractiveness according to the doe? Like, is she going to go to the... And that was just a fascinating study.
Yes, it was. It was a fun study. It was one of these studies that didn't have practical management application. And so the agency didn't fund that study. Okay. But they funded us to do a study on the fetal growth curve to determine, how can we accurately age fetuses that are collected in does when they're in pregnancy. And there's a growth curve that was developed in South Carolina back in the 80s that was used by our state. And we'd shown some evidence that maybe it wasn't as accurate as it might be among the different regions of the state because we have such varying body sizes of deer across the state. So they wanted to know, do we need a new one for Mississippi? So we had to control the breeding of the does to know when they were bred so that we could know how old their fetus was at a particular time.
I see. And that was agency funded.
That's the agency's funding. And then Bronson and I had been arguing for years whether or not it mattered to the doe. and in theory, yeah, it should matter. But in practice, when she's in standing estrus, she's going to be bred. She's going to allow herself to be bred by whatever buck is behind her. And that was my argument. And he said, yeah, but it has to matter. And so we finally had this opportunity after arguing for years about it would be really cool to test it. And we had this opportunity, so we did. And I took a semester figuring out how to attach artificial antlers, or actually real antlers, onto the heads of deer. And I think Bronson's already talked about that. That was a lot of fun.
That too, again, almost like anybody who's ever tried to make a contraption or to come up with an idea, it's for, like for the engineering brain.
Yep.
We were fascinated with that part of it. This little metal coupler that allowed you to take actual antlers that had been, sawed off, and we're going to put them on this deer, and then we're going to put them on this deer. And it was really fascinating.
My first trial was with PVC pipe. I thought, well, that'll be easy enough. And PVC pipe's not strong enough to handle the combative force of a buck with his antlers.
Yeah.
And before that, I thought, well, the easiest way to do this would be to use deer mannequins and put the different antler sizes on buck mannequins. And I talked to the agency at the time. I said, hey, could we borrow your movable deer?
Yeah.
So that they'd be more lifelike. And so we put different antler sizes on them. And they said, well, when would you need them? And I said, during the breeding season. And they said, no, that's when we need them.
Yeah, right.
So that wouldn't work. So I bought some of these just plastic molds that, you can buy.
Yeah.
And the does didn't care about those whatsoever. So
at all. Yeah.
We had to come up with this device to use real deer. And because I had deer from the Delta and the lower coastal plain and the thin loess regions in the state of Mississippi, and they vary in different body sizes, we had big bucks, medium bucks, and smaller bucks of the same age. And so we could take 2 bucks that had they were the same age. We cut the antlers off so the antlers weren't visible.
Okay.
And same age, and then we could manipulate the antler size. And in this case, look at the age, the same age but different body size. So that was a treatment, the body size treatment. We could control the age. People had hypothesized in the past that antler size mattered.
Yeah.
But the only times they had studied it was when they had older male deer with bigger antlers, also bigger bodies. They were more attractive to the females than a younger male with smaller antlers and smaller bodies. They had never teased out the real factor. And so we were able to use combinations of bucks that were the same age, different body size, different ages, same body size. So we use a yearling Delta buck and a 3-year-old lower coastal plain buck, same body size, and see, did they prefer the older buck or the younger buck? And so we looked at body size, age, and antler size. And surprisingly to me, age had nothing to do with it.
Okay.
And as an older single guy, I was really bummed out about that. I have no advantages.
Surely there's an advantage built in. That's funny.
But they didn't care about the age. Okay. They didn't care about body size. Absolutely no difference. The only thing that mattered was the antler size, and it was strongly mattered by the does.
Yeah. Isn't that something? Okay. So it matters to them. The antler size matters to the hunter.
Yep.
Matters to the doe. Genetics. Okay. That being the other, I would think, a million different offshoots of a way to study and come to, some sort of data-driven conclusion. Is it genetics that's controlling body size, antler size, or is it location, or is it food source, that kind of thing?
Well, that was another project that the agency funded us, looking at the causes of the regional variation in body size and antler size in our state.
Okay.
And the lower coastal plain down there, Hattiesburg, the sandier, low fertility soils. The main agriculture there is not agriculture per se, it's timber production, because that's the best thing you can do with that soil type. And it's not fertile. And deer are smaller down there. Delta, great soils, lots of commercial agriculture, traditional agriculture, and big deer. And so biologists, the agency biologists, myself for years said, well, it's all about the quality of the nutrition, the quality of the habitat. Lower coastal plain habitat is not as good as the Delta, and that's the difference. And a lot of landowners, hunters from the lower coastal plain and areas with smaller deer were arguing, well, no, we have genetically inferior deer. So we need to bring in some good genetics to help our regional deer population have bigger antlers, bigger bodies. And so the agency said, look, we need to resolve this. So we came up with a plan with them to look at the Delta versus the thin loess, which is a moderate-sized deer, moderate antlers, and then the lower coastal plain. We captured with them, and if you talk to any of the older biologists that were around in the 2000s when we were doing this, oh God, Demarais, that was such a problem. You made us capture all these deer. It's hard to go out and catch a deer on a given day exactly the type of deer you're needing.
Yeah.
I mean, and for darting, you need to be within 25 yards.
You got to get really close.
It's like bow hunting.
Yeah.
You can't go out on a given day and shoot a deer of a particular age and sex with your bow.
Yeah.
It's just hard work.
Yeah, you just can't snap your fingers and call your shot, so to speak.
So we got all these deer, bred does, brought to Mississippi State. We fawned them. They fawned, and then we put them into satellite facilities to be raised up to 3 years of age. And interestingly, the lower coastal plain and the first generation were these fawns of wild deer that we raised on optimum nutrition. Okay, in the first generation, lower coastal plain deer body weight didn't budge at all. They stayed small. Antlers got a little bit of a response, but not much. Delta deer, they were used to good nutrition. They improved a little, actually got a little bit bigger.
Okay.
And in the middle range, they started getting a little bit bigger bodies and a little bit bigger antlers, getting closer to the Delta deer. And so then we took these first generation deer and let them breed each other within the lower coastal plain first gen, thin lurs first gen, and the Delta. So we kept it within the regional genetics, let them breed, produce a second generation that had been raised on optimum nutrition and allowed to do their thing.
Okay.
And the lower coastal plain deer, in those second generations, by the time they were 3 years of age, they had numbers roughly 26 or 27 inches of more antler.
Wow.
And they 3-year-old lower coastal plain bucks, and after the second generation, 2 generations of good nutrition, were growing antlers and body as large as the wild harvested 3-year-old bucks from the Delta.
Okay.
So we were able to prove conclusively that it wasn't a genetic limitation in the lower coastal plain. It was all about what they ate and for how many generations.
Wow.
We couldn't do the study for a third generation because, limited resources. We had to move on to the next question. But it just shows that deer populations if there are no expectations for people, they rise to whatever the expectations, and think of the habitat quality as an expectation, a nutritional expectation. And the lower coastal plain deer were living for generation after generation in this low quality soil. If you've ever hunted in the lower coastal plain, the forage on the ground in the lower coastal plain are just a lot of waxy leaved browse species that are very, very low quality.
Okay.
And they're so dominant in the landscape that there's not much forb production underneath them.
Right.
And so the deer don't have much to eat. And so the deer grow to the body size that they need to be supported by
what's there.
By what's there.
And I wonder also, and this may be a dumb question, but less of a food source, do they also expend more energy traveling to get to and cover a food source to get what they need? They have to, go farther, travel farther?
Well, we haven't done that particular study, but there was a study done with elk years ago that looked at movement rates of elk during foraging activities, and the less dense the forage was across the landscape, the more they moved. And the more dense it was, the higher quality habitat, they moved less.
Makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, and you mentioned the first generation of that study, second generation of that study. So that covered how many years? 6 years?
Well, a generation is, basically a 3-year-old deer will have produced her first generation as a mother.
Okay.
In 3 years.
Okay.
So
it's a years-long study. It's not a...
Oh, yeah. And we wanted adequate sample size. And so it was actually about a 9-year study.
9 years. Yeah.
It was a long time.
And I would think too, trying to sort of put myself in your shoes as a researcher, it seems like you'd get a lot of satisfaction out of something like that. You spend almost a decade with this study, and what it does is you have something conclusive so that you're able to tell, the citizens in this state, the hunters in that Pine Belt area, okay, here's what we found. It's conclusive. It's food.
Yes.
And
food quality and quantity.
Yeah. And availability.
Yeah.
And to be able to, to come to that conclusion after studying something for almost a decade.
Yeah. And the fact that it's generational impacts.
Yeah.
So we really push the idea that you can't fix something with a year of something.
Mm-hmm.
They don't respond, especially in an area like the lower coastal plain that are tuned in to low quality food. And so if there's a particular flush of good food one year, they're not going to do anything about it because it's not, producing bigger bodied fawns and yearlings it's not going to happen because it's disadvantageous because they are adapted to low quality food. You have a good year, and you grow really big, and then you got to support that big in the next year when it's back down low. You can't do it. But the genetics were there for bigger bodies. And so what we learned once we started, understanding what we learned in terms of the results, we looked into the literature, and there's a term called epigenetics. And epigenetics generally is the phenomenon where genes can be turned off and turned on. And it's been shown clearly in a lot of different species, humans as well as research animals. Epigenetics matters. And so the switches are turned off in the does producing fawns that are living in this low quality habitat. And those switches didn't start to get turned on until the first generation produced their fawns, the second generation. Then the switches have been turned on a generation later.
And now they're beginning to respond to the available food and the quality of that food. Because
they're genetically able to trust the fact that, this is a permanent change. So what we advise landowners and hunters is don't do anything short term and expect to change. Right. Yeah, you might maybe a little bump, but if you really want to impact, do habitat improvements that are generational in existence that last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
And then you're really impacting the quality of your deer population.
Well, and you can see then naturally the sort of the advantageous nature of that relationship between the lab and the agency. Mm-hmm. As we've talked with people here at the agency who are involved with, the DMAP program, the other land management programs, working with private landowners and how to manage their property, all that information that would come from a study like that. I mean, I can just see the marriage of the Deer Lab and the agency.
Exactly.
It's such a good relationship, such a cool thing for Mississippi too.
Yeah. And the agency, talking about private lands managers, DMAP biologists, I mean, they need to tell people how to fix that habitat.
Absolutely.
So we've done a lot of work with timber management and how does timber management affect the quality of the habitat? So for example, in the lower coastal plain, I described it was generally a low quality deer habitat. Well, how do we fix this? So we did studies looking at thinning, at the mid-rotation thinning process. The first time you get some sunlight on the ground, but all these waxy-leaved brush species are there. And so we treated them with a selective herbicide and used prescribed fire after that to stimulate seed release from the duff layer. And in the lower coastal plain, we increased the nutritional carrying capacity 9-fold, 900% by just a traditional timber thinning operation, go in and remove the undesirable hardwood brush and mid-story, some of the mid-story hardwoods too, like sweet gum and things like that. They're of no commercial value and are actually draining resources from the pine trees that you're trying to grow as crops. So we basically removed the low quality stuff for the pines and for the deer and increased by 9-fold the nutritional quality. We basically started producing forbs on the ground that are so much more nutritional valuable than the brush that wasn't very valuable.
Well, and that's fascinating to think about too, from a landowner perspective, because they know what's there. They've known, and they get a hold of that information, and then the light bulb probably comes on for them, going, okay, so it's a longer term process of, if we're going to grow something here or implement something, but it's a short term thing. If I need to cut that sweet gum tree down, I can do that right now, and you can kind of get to work on it right away.
Yeah.
It's neat to
and these
about.
things are done on acres.
Yeah.
Selective herbicide application, and then fire is portions of a property.
Yeah.
But we also, talking about timber harvest, we looked at selective removal of individual trees and creating stumps, and we looked at the nutrient content of the minerals of the sprouts from the stumps.
Wow.
And they're so high in minerals and protein that Marcus Lashley, who used to be at Mississippi State Deer Lab, he coined the term mineral stumps.
Okay.
And we showed that they were highly selected for. Deer loved these mineral stumps. We even were able to show sweet gum mineral stumps being used heavily by whitetails. They don't eat sweet gum.
Right.
But the stump sprouts after you cut down a sweet gum are of value nutritionally.
It's just amazing.
Yeah.
And the farther we go, as you kind of explain this to me, I'm catching these tidbits of 40 years of, almost 50 years of experience of this kind of stuff from you.
Mm-hmm.
And we could do a part 1 and a part 2 and a part 3 and part 4 and maybe just barely scratch the surface, it sounds like, of what's there.
Well, and one of the things we've done a lot of at the Deer Lab is, we have our own podcast, Deer University, if I can plug that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We talk about our specific results and the research of others and talk about how it can be applied to managers. And we also, if I can plug our YouTube channel, we have a series of videos on there talking about various research projects. Timber management for deer nutritional improvement, for example, is one of them that we created and broke it out into 7 or 8 pieces of shorter videos that people can get on there and see specific. And I'll ramble sometimes into great detail, but if they'll put up with me a little bit, they'll learn something.
Yeah, we can put the description of those down at the bottom of our YouTube channel.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah, we'll
Great.
put that on there. Highly recommended too, by the way. Everybody loves those and the Deer Lab podcast. One of your former students, we recently talked with him, William McKinley, here at the agency, the coordinator of the deer program. And one of the things that he touched on was how important it is for the hunters in a state like Mississippi here to realize that they really are the first step and at the forefront of conservation efforts as it relates to numbers and how many, deer per hunter are harvested, throughout the year. And he talked at great length urging hunters in Mississippi, even this year, to look at it like one more per hunter would really help.
Yes.
In terms of those types of overall numbers, and from the Deer Lab perspective and the university perspective, getting that message across that hunters are involved in this effort too. You need to take more, shoot that doe this year.
Absolutely.
You're involved in that research. You're part of that also?
Well, we've been part of the effort to promote harvest for, the whole time I've been here. We have to, what I was taught when I was in grad school by a manager of the Knoxville National Wildlife Refuge. He taught me as I was a graduate student out there working a check station with him. He said, Steve, you don't educate individuals, you educate generations. And until you have a generation of people that have learned a new concept, you don't have successful adoption of that concept. And so back in the late 70s and the 80s, it was all about teaching people to harvest does. Well, they got pretty good at harvesting does, not enough, but made progress. And then we started teaching them about what antlers could do if you let the bucks grow older, and a generation or more of teaching hunters about let them go so they can grow and grow bigger antlers. And now we have a generation where we're teaching about managing CWD and how to deal with that problem. So we deal with a lot of educational issues, and that's one of the cool things about being in the Deer Lab is we are educators, but we also research topics so we can have the data to inform through education the effects. Oh, and before I forget, there's one last little tidbit about that environment and genetics project, the Delta, Thin Lurs, and the Lower Coastal Plain Deer. I said the Lower Coastal Plain Deer after 2 generations, got as big as the 3-year-old harvested bucks.
Yeah.
Well, the deer from the Delta region grew bigger too, bigger bodies and bigger antlers. And so if we, going into that project, we thought, well, the Delta deer is our gold standard. That's the best we can do. It's not. The quality of the habitat in the Delta could be improved. And we showed with 2 generations of better nutrition, the Delta deer just got a whole lot bigger and grew bigger antlers as well. So,
and again, for those listening, when they hear 2 generations, let's emphasize that again. When we say 2 generations, the time frame we're talking about.
Well, a generation, minimally for a individual deer, she's got her next generation out in 3 years.
It's minimally 3 years.
Yeah. And so the minimal impact to get a second generation, an individual deer that's a second generation deer, is 6 years. And you have to create a generation, a population of second generation deer. And in really effective management, you start seeing even better impacts if you go with third generation. So habitat management, land management to produce quality habitat for wildlife generally and for deer in particular is a long-term investment. It's not a one and done. Can't go out and thin your timber and, okay, I'm done. Mm-hmm. You got to manage that thinning. Consider selective herbicides, prescribe fire. Now we've learned through recent research that the traditional February, March burning time is not necessarily the ideal time to burn. It helps that first year, but the second year, the nutritional quality is back to where it was.
Okay.
If we did a study looking at June burns, and June burns are a significantly greater aid at controlling undesirable hardwoods. A February, March burn is not going to control your hardwoods. It'll burn them back, but the roots aren't killed, and the base root that they sprout from isn't killed, and so they're back in a year or two. So the winter burn, and everybody traditionally, historically, has done it in the wintertime because it's after the deer season, before the turkey season, and the weather's less susceptible to uncontrolled fires.
Yeah.
But doing it in the summertime is actually better nutritionally. We looked at the March burn, no burn, and a June burn, and looked at the nutritional carrying capacity. Now, the first year after a June burn, we've burned a lot of stuff back, and we sampled at the end of July, so it end of August, it hadn't had a lot of time to grow a lot of leaf matter.
Yeah.
But the quality of what was regrowing was absolutely higher than the February, March burn, and absolutely higher than the no burn. And we monitored deer activity into these plots. We did it on, we had 9 timber stands, and we had all 3 treatments in each of 9 stands. So we had a lot of replication spatially and numerically. It was a well-done study. And the deer in July and August were in the June burn, not in the March burn and not in the no burn.
Exclusively?
The greatest percent, that significantly greater number of deer were in the June burn stands because that's where the high quality protein was. Mm-hmm. And that showed they needed that protein. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of only burning in February, March is not what we recommend now. Yeah, it can be helpful, but it's not. If you're trying to control undesirable hardwoods, you don't need to be burning then because you're not going to do it. And if you're trying to stimulate, our biggest nutritional time in Mississippi and much of the Southeast is late summer. Protein content is extremely low. Digestibility is low. The plants, they've been green for 4 or 5 months, and there's just not much value to them nutritionally. And so the fact that we got rid of the old leaves and stimulated new growth of leaves by the June burn, that's why they came in. Mm-hmm. They followed the protein, not the quantity. They were after the quality.
So, and And that was what amount of time after the June burn? It was.
Well, this was by August, July and August. We monitored both months.
Okay.
July and August. The deer started coming in July as the resprouting was starting, and they stayed in there.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. And, you know, Steve, another thing I think about as I hear that information, it's all that experience, all those different studies that you were leading the way and a part of all those years. I can hear the thoughts of that 14, 15-year-old kid who's listening to this podcast, who's doing exactly what you did as a junior in high school in Massachusetts, going, wait a minute, I can do that for a living?
Yeah, yeah.
And that 15-year-old kid, 42 years from now, he'll be sitting in your chair telling the same kind of stories. Absolutely. With different results and different studies.
And we have a great program at Mississippi State, and we're very applied. We have a very strong applied program. We have a professor like me that's the deer guy. We have a duck guy. We have a turkey and quail guy. These are endowed professor positions that we've gone out and found people that say, hey, we need these kind of people training our students. And so we have 3 endowed chairs in our department in the game species. And so we'll always be carrying that torch moving forward for students that want to go and learn about game management, come to Mississippi State. And our wildlife agency, they want to hire guys and gals from Mississippi. Yeah. So oftentimes you want to get a master's degree also. It's not just a BS degree. You get a master's and you can be the next William McKinley.
Yeah. Or maybe the next Steve Demarais. You just never know.
You never know.
Professor, AKA deer guy.
Yeah.
At Mississippi State.
Yep.
Steve, it's great to meet you. Thanks so much. And really enjoyed that. Hope we get to do it again soon. Thanks for being on the show.
Been a real pleasure, Matt. Good seeing you again.
You too. You too. He is Steve Demarais, 42 years in deer ecology and management, 27 years at the MSU Deer Lab. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you outdoors.